Hi, welcome to Lecture 2 of Week 5 in the Sociology of Work and Technology. Today we're going to hear about Judy Wajcman's take on science and technology studies points of view on work and organizational technology.
I'm an urban gorilla, I make bombs in my cellar. I'm a derelict dweller, I'm a potential killer. I'm a street fighting dancer, I'm a revolution romancer.
Hi, I've assigned this reading from Judy Wajcman to contextualize Grint and Woolgar's reading and to just give you a bit more information on this point of view that's being advanced by what Wajcman calls STS scholars, or science and technology studies scholars. Chiefly, their claim is that successful or popular technologies don't succeed simply because they provide technically efficient or rational solutions to societal problems, and that technology does not simply enact the social or political interests of some particular group. To this end, STS scholars are both anti-essentialist and non-deterministic. They challenge the idea of an essence or an intrinsic stable meaning or usage of technology, and they wish to highlight the contingency of technology upon social relationships and social interpretations. To this end, they challenge both common sense ideas about technology as well as more critical views advanced by what Wajcman calls labor process theory. This basically refers to contemporary research that builds on Marx and Braverman's observations. Now, we've already encountered STS thinking a little bit with Grint and Woolgar, who used ethnographic data to argue that technology depends upon social context in order to become meaningful and thus useful. You'll remember that they showed how tech designers built computers with particular imagined users in mind. The layout and the design of the machines had these ideas baked into them, so to speak. Wajcman makes a very similar statement when she discusses scripts, and I mentioned this a little bit in the last video. As she says on page 775, in the design phase, technologists anticipate the interests, skills, motives, and behavior of future users. Subsequently, these representations of users become materialized in the design of the new product. As a result, technologies contain a script or scenario. They attribute and delegate specific competencies, actions, and responsibilities to users and technological artifacts. This should sound quite similar to Grint and Woolgar's discussion of the configured user. Now, what I think Wajcman does here is that she shows how Grint and Woolgar's argument might fruitfully be applied to understand how technology reproduces inequality along intersecting lines of class, gender, and race and ability. How? Well, as she shows, the tech industries may be thought of as a culture. She calls this the culture of technoscience. She says it can be thought of as a culture, just as we might say Queens has a culture or a neighborhood has a culture. Tech culture, as she shows, tends to be dominated by men and male points of view, most often white male points of view. We already saw this in the reading from Marianne Cooper a few weeks back. In that male-dominated culture, the presumed user of technology is almost always a man. This happens both intentionally and unintentionally. Because of this presumption of tech culture, the products of that culture look a lot like the context in which they're produced, which is to say that many technologies privilege male users in both overt, clear ways, and often, just as often, unintentional or implied, less clear kind of ways. Last time, I mentioned personal digital assistants being coded as female. I talked about Siri's voice always being, by default, a woman's voice. Well, think about it. Who would take for granted that a woman would serve them? Does that seem like a clear product of a male-dominated culture? Certainly does to me. In that instance, Siri or whatever digital assistant you use contains a script, right? That script is one in which some authority, the user, tells a woman what to do, and that woman, Siri, carries out that task obediently and without question. Now, you might say, but you can change the voice to a man. You certainly can. But again, what's the default setting? Right? What does the technology expect? What is the script that it's following from the get-go? Seems to me like it's following a particularly male script that addresses you as a presumed male user. In other words, if we imagine what the designers expected that most users would want, well, it seems to be that they presume that most users would want what a hegemonically masculine man might want. A woman to boss around. Similarly, Wajcman discusses technology used for housework and how those two tend to contain gendered scripts that both depend upon and reproduce gender roles. Now, Wajcman distinguishes her point of view and that of other STS scholars as differing from the sort of Marxist analyses put forth by Braverman and to a lesser extent Zuboff. For those two authors, technology had a distinct effect which served capitalist interests. You might remember this from a few weeks ago. You might remember that Zuboff claimed that technology served capital's interests in efficiency while also having the unintentional effect of making work less dangerous. STS goes one step farther beyond Zuboff's duality of technology. For STS scholars, the meaning and use of technology is incredibly contingent. It's not just that there are two sides, kind of like how Zuboff shows, it's that those different sides, those different meanings, those different potential interpretations are highly contingent, which means they're not determined either by who made the technology or the functions of the technology. Technology's use depends not simply on power relations between two classes, which is the focus, I would say, of Zuboff and Braverman, but upon a wide variety of factors that far exceed labor process theorists' analysis of class conflict. You might remember Braverman and, to a certain extent, Zuboff are kind of in the labor process tradition. As she says, the first wave of labor process theory argued that the capitalist imperative of profit and control led inexorably to de-skilling. So labor process theorists think that there's kind of one way in which technology will go. An STS perspective would indeed argue that the politics of technology is about the power to shape definitions, mobilize resources under specific conditions for particular purposes. However, it stresses that even theoretically specific conditions for particular purposes However, it stresses that even theoretically homogeneous groups, such as capital and labor, have differing definitions of goals and of how to attain them. If you think about that, we've already kind of learned that a little bit, but this is going a little bit farther, right? If we read Robinson said there's divisions along racial and ethnic lines in the working classes, and we've also seen that there are divisions along lines of gender, but she goes even farther and says, well, there are actually divisions when we talk about capital. Capitalists might all agree on profit making, but how do you attain profit making? Is it by implementing one kind of technology or another kind of technology? Is it by implementing a division of labor or Taylorism, or is it by implementing the sort of invitational kind of dynamics that I describe in the readings from my book that I assigned just a little excerpt? Which one is it, right? And so you have a conflict both within capital, not in terms of their goal, but maybe in the best way to do it. And the same thing goes for workers, right? They're not just this homogenous group. Along all those markers of social identity that we already discussed, but also just there's natural variation in even within each of those kind of identity groups that we talked about, right? So nothing can be taken for granted. There can be a broad agreement on a final objective, but the goals needed to meet it may be unclear and thus open to different definitions. And what they are is likely to emerge only over time. Labor process theorists have underestimated this complexity, uncertainty, and contextual character of knowledge about technologies, including that which is regarded as purely technical. So even things that we think of as purely technical, purely a matter of efficiency, can't be taken for granted because there are other things that could be construed as equally efficient or equally helpful in achieving some goal. And so it's really why a particular technology gets selected that needs to be explained. This is something we already kind of came into contact with when we discussed Grint and Woolgar in the last lecture. If you read that, right, you would see that. To bring this into a dialogue with what we've learned up to this point, I want to highlight that we've come into contact with at least 3 views of technology and techniques for organizing work. 3 ways of understanding these things. First, there's the instrumentalist or managerial point of view that sees technology and these techniques for organizing work as rational solutions to the problem of efficiency. Adam Smith, Friedrich Taylor, these are clear examples of this. We've also seen a more critical view, one that sees technology and organizing techniques as nothing but tools of domination along lines of class, gender, and race. This is best exemplified by Marx, Braverman, Zuboff, Robinson. Finally, we've also seen the view of technology and organizing techniques as being contingent or dependent upon multiple factors, including the context of production and the context of usage. The last of these highlights not just how society and technology are in constant interaction, but also the ongoing potential for social change in even the most mundane social interactions between, for example, yourself and a computer screen. In every chance of an improper interpretation of whatever it is that tech designers or capitalists or whoever want you to do when you're interacting with technologies, in every chance of improper interpretation, there is the possibility of producing a new mode of social interaction. I think that's fascinating. How about you? I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments. Let me know. And I'll see you in the next video where we talk about contemporary issues in the economy as we prepare to enter into fall break and then enter into the second half of the course. All right, I'll see you then. Bye.